US national debt has hit a record $40 trillion. Government borrowing is rising at a historic pace, and that's raising concerns about the state of America's finances. 10 years ago, national debt was under $20 trillion. That figure has surged over the past decade, with spikes during the COVID-19 pandemic. In the last year alone, it grew by $3 trillion, despite President Trump's promises to bring spending under control. According to the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, which monitors US national debt, that new figure, $40 trillion, equates to almost $120,000 of debt for every person in the United States. I'm hoping Wendy Edelberg will help us make sense of all those zeros. She's a principal at the geopolitical consulting firm WestExec Advisors. She's also a former chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office, which provides economic data to US lawmakers. Welcome to DW. We are used to governments talking in massive numbers, but 40 trillion in debt sounds like an awful lot. Is it?
Well, it is. The number that's actually more relevant to the way the debt affects the U.S. economy and the global economy is actually debt held by the public. That's a smaller figure, around $32 trillion. But I can't really wrap my head around what the difference is between 32 trillion and 40 trillion. So we can just stick with the fact that it's a very large number.
Okay. It's massive and rising, but is that necessarily a problem?
What it means is that we are paying higher interest rates than we would otherwise. It means we have less private investment in the United States than we would otherwise. And so we have a smaller economy and somewhat lower incomes. I wouldn't think of it as each individual in the U.S. has an obligation of something on the order of $120,000. I appreciate the Peterson Foundation's math, but it's not just this generation that has to bear the cost of that debt. It's all future generations. So you want to think about all of the income that we don't just have today, but the income that we're going to have going forward for many decades to come. And if you think of it that way, yes, we can clearly support the financing of this debt. We are a very rich country, and all projections suggest that we will remain a rich country. So we can pay the interest on this. We clearly, over any reasonable planning horizon, are in no danger of defaulting unless our politicians choose to. It would be a choice. We are a rich country that can pay this interest without too much of a burden.
Okay, so no chance of a US doing an Argentina in the 1970s?
Unless I think there's a political risk, but not an inextricable link between the amount of federal borrowing that the US government is doing and a risk of default. Our tax revenue as a share of GDP in the US is quite low relative to international standards. So even if we chose to completely balance our budget simply by increasing taxes, which would be an extraordinary choice only to do it on the revenue side, but even if we only chose to do it on the revenue side, taxes as a share of GDP would still be in the ballpark of where they are among rich OECD countries. So we clearly have the income to balance our budget if, for some reason, financial markets forced us to do so.
Okay, and can it keep rising at this rate?
I mean, it can't forever. At some point, we will push interest rates into such levels and reduce private investment in the U.S. to such levels that it will start putting strains on our economy. That's nowhere in the planning horizon. There's no reason why this is an urgent crisis. Right. It is simply year after year making us poorer than we need to be.
It's really interesting the way you've put that, because this is we think, looking at all these zeros, this is maths, but it's not maths. It's politics, where the US has chosen to accrue this debt and deal with it through growth. Here in Europe, we've tended to go the other way and try to close that gap by shrinking the state and imposing austerity, and that's not something you see for the United States.
Oh, it is very much politics. We in the United States keep showing election after election that there's a lot of federal spending that we really value. We value federal spending on healthcare. We value federal spending on support for the elderly. And, along with discretionary spending on both non-defense and defense programs. We value that spending. We don't want to tax ourselves to pay for it. So instead of using well-designed tax policy, we go a more costly route and we finance all of that federal spending with borrowing. International financial markets seem to be, persistently keen to lend us this money, but at ever rising interest rates that we can bear. But it is a political choice to finance all of this spending through this less transparent way of bearing the cost, a cost that's borne not just across people in the United States in a way that's not incredibly salient, but a way that's borne across generations. Doing it through well-designed tax policy, that's just politically a lot harder. People can see taxes a lot better than they can see the financial costs of financing spending through borrowing.
Okay. The dollar, of course, is the world's primary reserve currency. You seem quite sanguine about all these zeros. So presumably the rest of the world that depends on the dollar, they're not looking at this and saying, well, maybe somebody somewhere should do something.
Again, I don't want to suggest that there are no economic consequences to this. I think one of the reasons that interest rates are as high as they are in the US is because of all of this borrowing that we've done. So when potential lenders to the US government are thinking about whether or not they want to buy treasury bonds in the next auction or on the secondary market next week, they may well say, you know what, I need to get a higher interest rate if I'm going to be willing to do that. I think that that's an economic cost. The question is, do I think that's a crisis? No. And I think that this can go on. Now, the risk, again, is politicians. The risk is, do financial markets say that US politicians are not trustworthy, that we might do something silly like say that some foreign bondholders shouldn't actually get interest payments the way was floated in the first Trump administration? Do we say, you know what, we're not going to raise the debt ceiling and just see what happens if we miss a payment or two and just test bond markets? But those are political choices, and those are risks that I am very sure that bondholders, in major financial institutions around the world are thinking very closely about as they decide whether or not they want to lend to the US government.
So with that in mind, finally help us debunk a myth that keeps popping up on the internet, which is that China owns so much US debt that if it chose to call it in or sold it off cheap, it could tank the US economy. True or false?
It might have been somewhat true years ago when holdings in China were not just much larger, but much larger just share of total federal debt outstanding. It's now less true. China's holdings have come down a fair bit. So if China were to, and I think that this would be absurd for China to do because it would hurt them economically, but if China were to very abruptly sell all of its holdings of US treasuries, yes, that would no doubt push up interest rates, probably enough to pull in other buyers who would say, you know what, we'll hold the debt if China won't. I think the real risk is whether China were to do that and that were to spook markets. Why
Right.
is China doing that? Is this a Cold War of sorts? Is this a new era of global financial instability? So I think the why would matter
Okay.
as to whether or not that would actually create a crisis.
That's very clear. Thank you so much for joining us. Wendy Edelberg from
You're so welcome.
WestExec Advisors. Thank you.